regarding protecting worker health during wildfire events. So let's get started. Okay. Um, as Veronica stated, we've kind of got some clear objectives today. I know that this topic, it has a vast amount of questions. And so just today, we're going to be talking about these specific items. We're going to talk a little bit about what's in the smoke, because we are talking about some exposure issues. So we want to know what is smoke composed of. I'll go over some of the wildfire regulations that employers need to consider and think about when talking about wildland fires and after effects. I also am going to talk about how to determine when it's safe to proceed with the cleanup of a structure, some of the best practices for cleanup of smoke exposed structures, and these are the non-burned structures that will be discussed today. And then some recommendations for wildfire preparedness planning. So, we're in I'm in Southern California. I'm sure a lot of you are in Southern California. A lot of you are in California, and even in the United States at this point, wildfires are now ubiquitous. They'll be here. So some understanding of how to prepare for them so that you're best equipped to reduce exposures to individuals, occupational settings, communities, homes, etc. So as we are all well aware, there are a lot of fires here. Here are the ones just in 2025. It is January 30th. And we've already had several wildfires occur in just the Los Angeles County alone. In California, there have reported as of 4 days ago, so I'm not sure if it's changed, but over 300 wildfires alone in California. And with that, we've had over 57,000 acres burned. 28 fatalities and over 16,000 structures burned. And some of the ones that are still occurring are the Palisades, Eaton, and Hughes fire in LA County. I looked yesterday and it looks like they probably will be completely 100% contained in the next day or two. They were at between 95 and 99% contained. But that's a lot of fires and they're still ongoing. So it's really important for us to talk about this, especially with the devastation that we're seeing in our communities. I'm in, as I said, Southern California. I'm in the San Fernando Valley. So at one point I had 6 different wildfires surrounding my my area. So this is obviously near and dear to my heart, especially as a environmental health consultant in public health, but as a community member. So the big question is always what's in the smoke, because again, if we're talking about exposures and we're talking about worker health and safety, we want to know what is in that smoke that we're trying to protect people from. So in general, well, that's really usually a hard question to ask, right? Because smoke in general, the composition is dependent on the nature of the burning fuel source. So the source, what is burning, as well as conditions of combustions and other aspects. So that can include a colloidal mix of solids, liquids, gases, vapors, etc. So a bunch of different stuff coming together. So if we just list a few of them, there's carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, we've got our PAHs in there, which have potential carcinogens, formaldehyde, nitrogen oxides, you name it, lots and lots of stuff. And when I'm talking about just wildfire alone here, we're just talking about the burning of organic debris, right? We're just burning of shrubbery and trees, and it can already include all of these compounds. But then you add to it with these most recent fires, both in Southern California, and then we had the Camp Fire a couple of years ago, etc. We're not just burning wood anymore or forestry. We now have that urban wildland fire interface issue. So now we're burning communities. And with that, we're burning plastic materials, we're burning electronics, cars, building materials, etc. So now we saw that previous list. Now we're adding additional items. Maybe there's asbestos, heavy metals associated with the smoke particulate that's up in the air and settled surfaces, etc. So now we're adding even more to the list. There's a lot of different things that can be in that smoke. However, from a public health perspective, even though I gave you that laundry list of different contaminants, when we're talking about during a wildfire event, we're really looking for that particulate matter and evaluating whether or not someone's going to be impacted. So we're looking at that PM 2.5 and the PM 10 as the primary pollutant of concern, because that's the particulate that goes up in the air and is heavy enough to kind of like small enough to go up in the air, move through the winds and eventually can settle down on surfaces and move miles and miles and miles from a fire event itself. Some of the gas and vapors will just go up into the atmosphere. But we're primarily worried about that because we know that it can cause irritation to the eyes and respiratory tract system, especially for those who have pre-existing issues. And if you don't know about PM 2.5 and PM 10, what that really means, that's the size of the particulate. So the PM 2.5 is less than 2.5 microns in size and diameter of the size of the particulate, and PM 10 will be less than 10. So the less than 10 is usually those that don't necessarily reach the lungs, but they can irritate the eyes and nose, kind of get down a little bit. The PM 2.5 is the one that gets really down low. It's small enough to go through the respiratory system, get all the way down to the alveoli, and potentially into the bloodstream. So we're particularly worried about the PM 2.5. And if you want to put it in perspective, a human hair has a 50 to 70 micron diameter size. And you can see that. So think about the 2.5, how small that actually really is. So the size of the particulate definitely matters when we're talking about exposures. And here are just some of the health effects that reportedly occurred during wildfire events. We've got the respiratory tract irritations, wheezing, dizziness. Again, if someone is a part of the sensitive population, maybe with pre-existing respiratory issues or cardiovascular issues, are more prone to exhibiting health effects, pregnant women, children, etc. And then now we've added onto this list during wildfires, not just the health effects of the body, but also the anxiety and grief. We've gone through these fires year after year after year. So the stress of not knowing if your home will be there after the fire event, having to evacuate. I know I was on constant watch with the Watch 2D app during the wildfires, just looking to see where the evacuation zone, where are the warning zones, what am I going to do if I have to leave, having your phone on in the middle of the night and waking up to alerts. So there's a lot of anxiety and grief that's also associated with these wildfire events that really impact the communities themselves. And as you may already know, again, if you are in Southern California or been impacted by a wildfire, that we're not talking about just the wildfire perimeter in which it occurred. And this also will go in understanding this when we talk about cleanup of wildland fires and unburned structures. The burn area is, yes, definitely an important area, and that's where a lot of the devastation occurs. But that does not necessarily mean if you're not within those locations that you won't be impacted and that you need to follow health and safety regulations, et cetera, with cleaning up of of facilities or structures. So that's really important to know that that's just one area, but a lot of us can be impacted. And some photos here that are representative of that is we've got a photo of the campfire on the left-hand side, where you see that point right here is where Paradise is, and you can see the smoke traveling towards the ocean and heavy impact in the Bay Area, if anybody remembers that, or in that location in 2018. So although there's devastation in Paradise, a lot of communities and individuals were impacted by that fire event. And there's no exception to that for the recent fires as well. So the top left-hand side, this is the Kenneth fire area. That was probably the fire that was closest to me. So you can see the smoke billowing throughout the city area going towards the ocean. On the right-hand side, we have the I believe that's the Palisades fire, all the smoke impacting the Malibu area and the Palisades area. And there's an aerial view here on your left-hand side that shows the the Palisades fire here on the left-hand side, going straight to the ocean. And then the Eaton fire here in the Altadena, Pasadena area, just heavily impacting the greater Los Angeles area on its way to the ocean. So a lot of people miles and miles away from the actual fire perimeter were heavily impacted by smoke-related particulate, and cleaning and other additional information is relevant for these groups as well. So let's talk about what regulatory guidelines and standards are out there. So Cal OSHA was one of the emerging states, right, to first develop a standard for wildfires. Along with that, they also have worker safety guidelines. So we have the Title 8, 5141.1, which is the protection for wildfire smoke, and I'll go into a little detail about that. But in addition to that actual regulatory standard, they have developed guidelines on how to protect workers during and after wildfires. So there's one regarding protecting indoor workers from wildfire smoke with building ventilation systems, worker safety and health during fire cleanup, which we'll go over, and then safety and health of workers rebuilding after wildfires. So 5141.1, if people aren't aware of this, that is, it was an emergency regulation that went out with regards to protection of workers during wildland fire events. It applies to employers when they reasonably anticipate that employees may be exposed to wildfire smoke, and there is an AQI for PM 2.5 at a value of 151 or greater, regardless of the other AQI for other pollutants. So if we know about the EPA AQI values, those are outdoor parameters that they look at to evaluate outdoor air quality. We have our PM 2.5, the PM 10, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, a few other different pollutants that they're looking at, sulfur dioxide. But when we're talking about implementation and when it applies to the standard, we're looking at just that PM 2.5 as the primary driver. Those exempt from the standard are wildland fires or firefighters because they all have their own regulatory regulations associated with their work. And it does not apply to enclosed structures with mechanical ventilation system or enclosed vehicles in which the air is being filtered. And so what that's kind of saying is most people think it's an outdoor standard for those working outdoors, but it does apply to those working indoors if they don't have a mechanical system. So maybe a barn, a warehouse that just relies on natural ventilation for the space, they would be included and this standard would apply to them. But if you're in a, let's say, an office building with a mechanical ventilation system, filtration system, etc., this standard does not apply to you. And also doesn't apply if the exposure is for less than an hour, or if you can prove that your own specific location has PM 2.5 data that would equate to a AQI value of less than 151. So what the standard allows you to do is to look at the websites to obtain this PM 2.5 data, so you can use these specific ones, the US EPA Air Now, Interagency Wildfire Fire Air Quality Response Programs, California Air Resource Board, your local air quality control districts, management districts, etc. Doesn't say purple air, although those do have some relevance and information, but these are the websites that you can use to determine whether or not your facility or location applies to this data. But again, if you have your own monitor and you want to measure PM 2.5 in your specific location because you don't feel maybe the data that's represented in these websites is relevant to your area, then you can do that as well. And there's a small little table here that again shows you, and we all know that AQI value does not equal concentration. There is a calculation associated with that. So a 0 to 50 good would actually equate to a 0 to 9 micrograms per cubic meter of that PM 2.5. And just go over real quickly again, that what else is included in the 5141.1 is within the standard, you have to establish communication with workers so that it's in a language understandable to them about the hazards associated with the work, train them on the health impacts of wildfires, what they need to do to protect themselves, what control of harmful exposures you're going to implement. Maybe engineering may not necessarily work because if it is an outdoor worker, you're not really going to put local exhaust ventilation system or some type of filtration system out there, but maybe you're implementing administrative controls, moving the work area to another location, stopping work for the day, etc. And then we have the respiratory protection of it's voluntary if it's greater than 151, but required once you get to that AQI value of 500. So that is a stand, and I know we're not supposed to be talking about that completely, but I really felt it's relevant that people do have an understanding of that standard because again, as of right now, there's still a wildfire occurring in here and they may be occurring shortly after today as well. So individuals need to understand their rights and how they can be protected from wildland fires during wildfire events that are actually occurring at that moment. And then in addition, we have, again, as I stated, just general guidelines that are available from Cal OSHA, protecting indoor workers from wildfire smoke with building ventilation systems. So again, these would be considered exempt from 5141.1, but there are additional recommendations because we want to continually try to reduce potential exposures. Because I've noticed there's a lot of different variations in buildings that would allow for entrainment of the outdoor air, being smoke, coming into the space. So they give recommendations of making sure that you restrict exits and entries into the building. So if you think about it again, it's an outdoor source that's coming into the building. So you want to shut the windows, seal them, shut the doors. If you've got 8 entries into your building, maybe we limit it and only have 2 entries into the building. So we're not allowing the outdoor air to enter the space. Ventilation. And when we go into preparation and planning for wildfires, I'll go into more detail about this, but you want to make sure that they're constantly operating, you're shutting outdoor air intakes or limiting the amount of outdoor air being introduced, making sure you have high rated filter efficiency in your filters, making sure they're well fitted, they're not dirty. You may be changing them a little bit more often, especially we've had these fires, what, 3 weeks now they've been occurring, maybe? Yeah, a little bit over 3 weeks, some of them. So, you would go constantly looking and make sure that there's no overloading of your filters. And then maybe even the introduction of air scrubbers, HEPA filtration devices. Maybe you're adding charcoal filters because it's an area where you're getting some of the odors. And then also they talk about maybe allowing for telecommunicating, alternating work assignments so that people are staying away from smoke impacted areas while working. So here we go, the worker safety and health during fire cleanup. So that's what we're here today, and what we really want to talk about is how do we protect workers who are cleaning up this material, the ash, the soot, etc. So when I think about it, there's 2 different aspects about the fire cleanup. There are the ones of the destroyed and damaged buildings, and then there's the non-burned structures. The photo here on the left is actually a photo that I collected 2 days ago. I was in the Palisades and I was doing an evaluation of a non-burned structure, but I'm looking across the street from this person's home and this is what I'm seeing. So these are the destroyed, damaged buildings that are going to be completely demolished, materials removed, and homes rebuilt eventually. So we're not going into details about that today. There are some references that will be provided later, and maybe I touch upon a little bit about it during the presentation, but that's a whole another topic that requires additional information, a lot more discussion than we have allotted for today. But we're going over the non-burn structure. So we have the photo here on the top right where you have burned properties to the left and then standing structures to the right. So ones that are really in close proximity to the burn zones within the fire perimeter itself. And then we have the situation as well of those, if we look down to the bottom right, that may not necessarily be within the fire perimeter, but were impacted by smoke being infiltrated from outside the burn area and now moving into the adjacent communities. So when we're talking about Cal OSHA, they say that worker safety and health during fire cleanup guidelines that employers need to performing cleanup and other work in areas damaged or destroyed by fires are required to identify and evaluate these hazards, correct any unsafe or unhealthy conditions, and provide training and instruction to employees. And they cite several regulations. So there is, if you're not aware, Cal OSHA does have a worker safety and health during fire cleanup guidelines available. It's on their website, and it goes over the standard that I spoke of and some of the guidelines, but they do go into specifics on fire cleanup guidelines available. And so those are important for you to know. So to me, a lot of those guidelines are talking about that left-hand side photo, but they could be applicable to the non-burned structure property up on the top right, where, again, maybe they weren't necessarily completely burned, but maybe there is some vegetation at their property burned, or they're so close to another one that they may also be impacted to a larger degree than, let's say, the bottom right area. So that evaluation and understanding of the hazards is very important in determining worker safety when doing the cleanup, as well as how to clean it up. So let's just kind of go over in a nutshell what we're dealing with here, okay? We know that fire, debris, ash, and dirt from residential or structural fires may contain asbestos, heavy metals, and other hazardous substances, along with that laundry list I previously told you about. We know that with these burn structures, we are adding additional contaminants to our list of smoke composition. We also know that exposure to these toxic substances can occur through inhalation, us breathing it in, inhaling it, it's going down as far as it can, depending on its size, and to potentially our bloodstream. We also know that there is dermal exposures. Again, we have potential, again, those polyaromatic hydrocarbons, volatile organic compounds, semi-volatile organic compounds that potentially can be a route of exposure through contact with the skin. And we also know that there's potential ingestion issues. So in some areas we have contamination of drinking water supplies, but also, let's say, for instance, lead. You can be dealing with cleanup of lead materials, maybe not have as good as hand hygiene as you should, or other hygiene measures, and potentially go eat lunch afterward. And an exposure route can be through ingestion. So all of these 3 different routes of exposure need to be thought of, potentially evaluated, as well as when we're developing the personal protective equipment, determined for the level that's necessary. And then we also know improper handling or disposal of this fire debris can increase these risks and spreading hazardous substances throughout the community, endangering workers, residents, environment. So they need to be handled appropriately. So before anybody does a work in all industrial hygiene, right? We have the HazCom standard, An employee has a right to know what they're being exposed to and how to protect themselves, etc. When we're dealing with those completely burned structures, I know that a lot of the current requirements is that people have HazWOPER training, because they'll be sifting through, some of us are, we at FACS, we're doing assisting with the characterization of the hazardous waste. So we have people that will be going out and sampling for asbestos and heavy metals, etc. Those individuals sifting through the burn debris themselves in large accumulations at these properties will be required to have HazWOPER, and I'm in complete agreement with that. But when we're dealing with these non-burn structures, again, where they have a lesser degree of impact as compared to the burn structures, at a minimum, they need the hazard communication standard, and they meet those requirements in ensuring that they know exactly what is occurring and what needs to be done in terms of training. So at a minimum, I would say training that should be included is the health effects of wildfire smoke particulates, what's in the smoke itself potentially. Again, we're not probably characterizing every single situation, but they should know about the potentials based on the site-specific information. And before I even go further, I just want to again state that there's going to be different levels of severity or impact to structures based on a lot of different considerations. What was the wind direction? How close are they? What is the conditions of the home? Was there a lot of smoke that was able to get into the space, etc.? So there's a lot of different parameters. So I'm kind of generalizing a lot of this topic. But we did need to know that each situation may be different, so that needs to be considered when providing trainings, as well as the level of PPE and cleaning methods, etc. So again, back to it. What training should be included? You could then the health effects, the potential composition of the smoke, what proper cleaning methods should be utilized, what controls are going to be put in place to try to reduce exposures to the individuals doing this cleanup work. Within that, the personal protective equipment that will be utilized by the individual, the type that will be used, along with the limitations of this personal protective equipment, hygiene methods that should be used, good hygiene practices, and then housekeeping. at a bare minimum, this is what should be included in any training for employees performing cleanup of the non-burn structures. And OSHA does have a what they call wildfire cleanup training tool. It's a one-pager that kind of goes over limiting information, I would say, but just a quick little snippet of, what are the dust control measures that should be used, what's the PPE at a minimum that should be used, etc. So that's a good start. But definitely, if you're doing a training for your employees, I think it would require a lot more additional information to try to get them up to date in what specific hazards are associated with their work and how to control it. So some of the questions that come up that I've seen a lot are, what do we need to do? Like, what considerations need to take place before we even think about or go into a property or beginning the cleanup process? Let's say you were evacuated from your your place of employment. Let's say it was a childcare facility or a gym. And they're saying, okay, well, the evacuations have been lifted. It's time we can go back to the building. And so some of the considerations that need to be thought of before going in is, one, is it safe to enter? Two, do you have access? For instance, again, I was in Palisades 2 days ago. Getting access, it was the first full day they allowed access. And I would say it was quite complicated to get access to facilities up in that area. One, it's highly restricted. You needed to be with the property owner or the homeowner with them together. Only one car was allowed. We had to wait in the line for 2 hours just to prove place of employment to allow us into the space. While we were in there, there were several checkpoints from the National Guard was there, again, checking and making sure that you were allowed access into these specific areas. So that's definitely something that needs to be thought of is, do you have access? And again, is it safe to enter? Are there utilities? Do you have running water? As we know, a lot of the drinking water in the Palisades area and some of the Altadena and Pasadena areas were heavily impacted, and they are restricting water use. So you can't even wash your hands with the water at this point. So that's definitely something that needs to be thought of before re-entering these spaces. And then again, what is the level of impact? Are we someone that had such a closed building, wonderful windows that it's only minor impact and you're just seeing a little bit of smoke particulate in the settled dust? Or are you walking in and it smells like the fire was within the building, heavily impacted, you smell it, you see it, etc. And then some additional questions: what are the preferred cleaning methods? How do I protect myself? And what can I do after I clean? So before you go in cleaning, you need to be evaluating these specific issues. So personal protective equipment. During post-fire cleanup and recovery operations, employers must provide employees with appropriate personal protective equipment. So that is a requirement. But how do you determine what level of PPE is required? Well, that obviously takes someone with knowledge of evaluation of hazards as well as development of controls, the industrial hygienists, environmental health, occupational specialists, etc. So we want to make sure that we're selecting the type of PPE that will protect the worker from the identified hazard, that it fits them appropriately, that they're trained on the use, maintenance, and limitations of this PPE, as well as ensuring employees use this personal protective equipment that we're going to be given to them. And I'll go into more detail about the different types of PPE in 2 or 3 slides from now. But just an understanding, again, that there's going to be various situations and different scenarios. So before going into, there's no one size fit all. So before going into any building, you need to take these into consideration. And as we said, before entering, there's just general health and safety issues. So we know that before entering any heavily damaged area or destroyed community, that we need to think about safety issues such as, is there any damage or fallen power lines and power poles? Is there electrical safety issues? Is there potentially a structural safety issue where the house shifted? We had the rains that occurred. We always have after wildfires and we get those heavy rains, we're always worried about potential mudslides. So the structure may be standing, but is there a structural issue because it's on a mountain and the rains recently came and now there's a potential for it to to have structural integrity issues. So we need to be thinking about that beforehand. Are there sharp objects? So the property may be standing, but let's say portions of the burn structure, debris, etc., have come and wind driven come to your area. And so we want to make sure that there's no sharp objects, any potential flammable gases, etc. These are all things we need to think of before entering a space itself. And then there's the health issue. So is there, we have heat illness, is there chemical hazards, other exposures to building materials such as potential asbestos issues. Again, we have the smoke-related particulate issues, just the charred ash and the soot, silica, metals, PAHs. So there's a lot of different other health hazards that need to be evaluated. And so how do we evaluate that, right? How do we know and determine the level of impact so that we can then help develop the appropriate remediation recommendations as well as worker protection measures that should be implemented, the PPE, etc. So there is a technical guideline out there. It's it was developed in part by AIHA. It's a technical guide for wildfire impact assessments for the OEHS professional. This one was developed in 2018. It's the current version available in the next week or two. We're hoping to get version 2. This version is a little outdated in that it really just focused on the old school wildfires, I guess I could say, where it was just burning of forestry. But as we know, we now have these wildland urban interface fires where we're burning the structures. So the newest version has a lot more detail. This was, I think, 30, 40-page document is now a 90, 100-page document because it goes a lot into the other potential contaminants that can be within a fire debris itself. So that is a document that people can look at to kind of assist them in evaluating how to determine level of impact from a wildfire. So if I just go into basics of it, what we need to know is we need to begin with gathering our background information. How close was the property or structure to the actual fire event? Where was the smoke going at that time? What is the fire behavior, the wind directions, etc.? So is it maybe, again, I'm in the San Fernando Valley, 6 fires surrounding me. I wasn't impacted as much as the majority of people. The wind direction seems to push all the fires in different areas and not necessarily impact me. But if we were just to go by proximity, you would think it would have been a lot worse than what I actually had. So those are a lot of different information that we need to know. And once you get out there and actually look at the property, you're going to want to do your visual investigation and your olfactory investigations. Because we said that smoke is composed of gases and vapors and particulates, so this colloidal mix of a bunch of different things. So, we want to do that odor evaluation because the odors may not necessarily reflect what you're visually seeing. The project that I went to in the Palisades 2 days ago, a very nice home, really closed up, not a lot of visible findings. That I'm not seeing a lot of smoke particulates or staining, but I definitely could smell it. Even with my N95 on, I could smell it at really high severity levels throughout the entire space. So we then start thinking, again, that's probably the gases and vapors that are getting in there, not necessarily reflecting just the smoke particulates, which a lot of people like to look at, but don't always tell the complete story. Because the more closed off your home is, the less likely you're going to get some of that stuff from coming in. So and then along with the visual observations, we're going to want to identify pathways, because are we just recommending cleaning? Is it just segregated to these exterior entry points, or is it potentially going further within the property or the structure or your business? So that's going to help dictate the level of cleaning. Again, and the level of cleaning as well as, again, the worker protection, which we're talking about. And then there's sampling available, conclusions and recommendations. So as a hygienist, this is something we can do and use this document to identify the level of impact to help develop these cleaning recommendations and worker protection to remove this wildfire debris from structures and businesses. So when we talk about respiratory protection, right? Again, Not one size fits all. If we look at the LA County, they have a lot of guidelines available. They're saying at a minimum for wildfire cleanup of non-burn structures, an N95 or a P100 is appropriate. But as we know, as industrial hygienists, again, there's various scenarios that may change this level of PPE that's going to be required because we want to make sure that we're identifying what the potential hazards are for these specific areas. And with that, then we may determine if we need a higher level of respiratory protection, or again, if just this P100 or N95 is sufficient. Within that LA County document I'm referring to, and I believe we'll have references of that. They do put that you have the importance of a proper fit, as always. If people are going to wear respiratory protection during this cleanup, we need to make sure that they're wearing it appropriately. Talk about fit testing, and that they're trained on how to don it, doff it, etc. But the LA County document does talk about higher level for people who must be outside for extended periods of time in an ash covered area. So yeah, so that they kind of put in there that there will be circumstances where maybe we need to wear that half face respirator with a higher assigned protection factor, full face respirators. And I'm thinking these are more of the situations, again, when we're getting closer to the burn area. We know there's a lot of other potential contaminants. Obviously, P100s and N95s are for filtering of particulate, so they're not addressing the potential for gases and vapor exposures. But could be a good fit for, again, if we're dealing with just that smoke particulate further down the road for structures that are trying to reopen or for cleaning. And then the importance of, again, before we put people in N95s, we know that it makes it harder for them to breathe. So we want to make sure that people are medically fit to wear these and are able to wear them without causing additional issues. And I recently found this poster from NIOSH, and I just think it's wonderful because it just kind of goes over again facial hairstyles and filtering face piece respirators, the good and the bad that you can have. Because everyone if you have facial hair, people really like their facial hair. So sometimes it's, you go to do some fit testing and you see someone with facial hair, and usually you're like, no, but NIOSH does kind of show that there are some circumstances where people can have facial hair and it doesn't cause any seal issues or potential exposure issues. So if you don't have this, if you do fit testing and you don't have this document or flyer, I would definitely recommend you getting it because it's quite interesting and fun to show people. So additional, so we went over the respiratory protection and just go over again, minimum N95, P100. To me, that is appropriate for when we're just dealing with the particulate itself, and maybe we're not agitating the smoke. So maybe for people who are doing inspections of these properties, I would say an N95 at this point should be sufficient. We're not causing anything to become airborne or creating too much of an issue and then those locations that are further away or weren't as heavily impacted as others, that should be sufficient. With personal protective equipment, again, we talked about the routes of exposure, right? We had, again, inhalation, dermal exposure, and ingestion. So with that, we know that we're going to want to protect the body along with the respiratory system. So with that, we have recommendations for wearing gloves. So we want to protect hands from cuts or harmful ash, dust, dirt, and chemicals during inspection and cleanup. If you're not, again, I keep going to the burn debris. There you might want, cut resistance and larger, more intense gloves. But for the non-burn structures, I'm thinking, the disposable gloves, the nitrile gloves should be sufficient. And I would, again, recommend that because you want to make sure to dispose of these items after you're done, before you eat, etc. Long sleeve shirts and long pants. In some instance, and this could be people's work clothes. I know when I went out 2 days ago, I was not wearing disposable Tyvek, but when I got in my car, and I was only out for about an hour and a half, when I got back into my car, I could smell the smoke on me. And even when I came home and put them in the laundry, straight to the washer, took a shower, went back into my car, I still felt like I could smell it. So to me, the closer you are to the burn area, you may want to consider wearing disposable coveralls so that when you leave the site, you're disposing of that and not impacting the clothing that you're driving home with and bringing to your house. So that's highly recommended. But again, if you're further out and you're not smelling smoke odors, just the long sleeve shirts and long pants should be sufficient. Next, sturdy closed-toe shoes. You want to keep your feet safe from debris or any other sharp objects, etc. And then safety goggles, not glasses, the goggles, because again, we want to protect the eyes completely for any harmful ash or dust or dirt that can be stirred up during the inspection or during the cleanup. I think I lost my page here. Here we go. Sorry. Yeah, so that we're making sure that we're protecting our eyes as well. So during the cleanup, we want to make sure that we are trying to reduce exposures and not creating a more harmful environment. So when doing cleanup, we want to make sure that we use measures that control dust levels. So we want to work practices that result in excessive aerosolization of dust and debris should be avoided. So let's say, using a broom and dry sweeping could potentially cause stuff to be airborne. So that's stuff we want to avoid doing. And so if I want to just generalize it, the suggested methods include damp wiping, misting surfaces prior to doing any cleaning, HEPA vacuuming with shrouded tools, or using vacuum systems with HEPA filtered exhaust points. If we want to go, and then also again, part of the training portion of the people who will be doing this work is they also need to recognize that these cleanup methods may cause health effects within them, especially, we want to protect them, but they should be able to recognize the symptoms associated with exposures, especially if they have those respiratory and heart conditions. So they need to pay attention to how they're feeling while they're doing the work to report it to their employer if they begin to experience it. So general cleanup methods for exteriors. Again, it's all dependent on proximity, but the majority of times surfaces can be washed with a detergent water mix using manual or power washing methods. Furnishing soft goods like patio furniture, or let's say any soft items that someone has outside their building or their residence can be machine washed with a hot water and detergent, or there's HEPA vacuuming and hand washing. If we have hard items like patio tables or glass exterior walls, those can be washed and rinsed twice using the same type of hot water and detergent. For hardscapes, people's just the concrete ground, they can gently sweep into a pile for disposal if it's large accumulations. If not, hosing it down with a detergent water mix is appropriate. What we don't want, again, is the potential for stuff to be aerosolized and having more of that airborne dust for potential additional exposures. So no leaf blowers, that's a complete no-no. And although it's easy to clean up that way, it's a no-no because we're exposing ourselves as a person doing it, and we're actually just moving it to different locations. And per LA County, ash may be thrown away in the regular trash by placing it in a plastic trash bag first, within another trash bag, and then throwing it in your normal trash cans. LA County also has some guidance on exterior gardens. What they say is that heavily impacted areas, if there's a large accumulations of char and ash and fire debris, get rid of any of your foods, your produce, etc. But if it is lightly impacted, which is minor, maybe char and ash you're seeing out there, or you don't visibly see anything at all, they say you can keep your produce, so you can pre-rinse outside, make sure to wash your hands thoroughly before bringing it inside, removing maybe the outer layers if we're talking about leafy greens, soak deeply vined greens like kale, etc. But yes, they say it's still appropriate to consume, but they also state, and I agree with, when in doubt, throw it away. If you don't feel comfortable with it, throw it away. So any facilities that have any potential gardening vegetation should reference the LA County guidance documents available. Once we enter the interior of structure or building, a lot of these groups that will be doing this type of work, let's say it could be janitorial staff, domestic workers, housekeeping, EVS, they may be doing a lot of this interior cleaning, so they need to know, again, to protect themselves, as well as some of the methods that should be appropriate to reduce it from becoming airborne or moving to adjacent spaces. So for walls and ceilings, you can wipe those down with detergent water mix. Flooring can be HEPA vacuumed or wet wipe. Carpeting can also, if you've got carpeting, which is a porous material, you can do carpet cleaning. In some instances, you may need to dispose of carpeting depending on the level of impact. Again, when we talk about vacuuming, we really want to point out that it is a HEPA vacuuming, not a shop vacuum, which a lot of commercial buildings and facilities may have, or residential properties may have those household vacuums. Those are not appropriate for cleaning. We want these high efficiency filter systems that filter out small particles instead of blowing them back into the air where people can breathe it. So that's very important. A lot of facilities usually don't have these on hand, so that's something that would need to be purchased, or if you can't do it in-house, hiring a qualified company to come out and to do the work with the proper equipment. And then for contents, you can launder them, machine wash it. Dry cleaning is acceptable for these areas. In some instances, again, it may be based on the level of impact, you may just be disposing these items. So maybe a structure that's right next door to a burned structure, and they had poor window seals, etc. And so a lot of stuff got into their space. You may be considering of disposal of items because cleaning won't be sufficient to remove the odors from the materials. Other household goods, washable household items, including ceramics, can be washed using hot water and detergents. And so a lot of this stuff can be done, again, based on the level of impact. If it's low impact, by EVS staff, your domestic workers, housekeepers, general employees, etc. If it gets to a higher level of impact, I would recommend using a qualified remediation contractor who specializes in this and knows how to clean it properly without causing exposures to themselves, to the rest of the people in the building, and cleaning it up appropriately. And then there are some instances when I say professionals should be contracted regardless. So that's if we're dealing with potential impact to the HVAC systems. So if there's any cleaning or suggestions that it needs to be cleaned, that should be done by a qualified mechanical company that does work in accordance with NADCA, which is National Air Duct Cleaners Association, and then the attic space. Because again, attic spaces are some of the locations that are probably more impacted because they don't have the ability to shut the vents usually, and they don't have mechanical systems cleaning the air. So usually you see a lot of smoke debris in those spaces, and we don't want unqualified individuals cleaning these areas, because not only would there be an issue with exposure to the smoke debris and particulates, we're also dealing with some of the other nasty stuff that are in attic spaces. So we know that there's insulation, which can be composed of fiberglass, and we also know of asbestos potentially in attic spaces. So that definitely should be performed by a professional cleaning company and those qualified to do that type of work. Other health and safety practices that should just be adhered to, along with some of the stuff we previously talked with, was just having good hygiene. If you're going to be doing this work, the workers need to understand that all the routes of exposure. So we need to make sure that you are, after you're taking off and doffing your PPE, that you're washing your hands before you're eating, making sure that they launder their clothes after they've been exposed to this, because again, as I said, the smoke may stay there and we don't want to bring it home and expose other individuals to it. One good suggestion is removing your shoes. We track in a lot on our shoes, as a lot of us know. So If you're going to be doing work and you're not wearing booties, remove your shoes before walking into your home and introducing contaminants into that space. And then always do not eat or drink in work areas. Again, the ingestion route issue that we're dealing with, we want to make sure that while they're doing the work, they're separating the work area from a non-work area. And some additional considerations to think of after remediation cleaning. One thing I'm suggesting, again, particularly areas that were maybe next to the burn structures, is thinking about doing a post-remediation assessment to verify that whatever work was done was appropriate, because we may or may not be doing the initial assessment, and we know that smoke likes to move around in the ways it does. So people will provide initial cleaning efforts, but based on the level of impact, you may want to come and verify that that was appropriate and did get everything that needed to be removed and cleaned. And then also the fact you need to understand that there will probably be continual cleaning efforts, particularly if the wildfire is still occurring or if you're next to one of those burn zones. Having that in mind, thinking about those potential pathways in which that smoke could get into the building or your business. So maybe shutting doors so that it's not coming in, or, remember we talked about limiting door spaces, shutting the doors, and then paying particular attention to those exterior entry points to see on a daily basis, are we seeing accumulations? We don't, we might see a little bit, which we can clean up. We don't want to see those large accumulations. Maybe air monitoring might be necessary. I know that I did a project in Malibu, when they had the Woolsey fire in 2018, I believe it was. And we worked for a school district there that was really worried about continual impact from the burned areas after the fire had occurred and it impacting their schools. Sorry. So we did air monitoring. We put long-term monitors out for about a year because it took a while to get all of the burned materials removed and the houses rebuilt. And it was just a way for them to get a sense of, was the burn areas impacting their schools inside the buildings and outside the buildings. So we had some monitors outside as well as inside. We had little threshold values, and when we got certain levels, they would then begin implementing additional controls, for instance, not allowing kids to be outside for long periods of time, beginning to shut the outdoor air intake. So that's something that may need to be implemented for some locations as well, and something that might need to be considered, because the fire's done, but doesn't necessarily mean we're over it and that there's no additional measures that need to be evaluated and controlled. After cleaning and remediation, we also want to continue, again, for that same reason, shutting and sealing any suspected pathways. When I'm doing investigations now of companies that are trying to reopen, I'm looking for those pathways. One facility I just went to, I saw little gaps in the doors, which is usually not that big of a deal, an exterior door, a little gap in between. But again, we're trying to reduce exposures of the outdoor air coming inside. That's something that probably should be sealed at this time with maybe painter's tape around the gaps, or other rubber gasket material to try to seal any gaps around doors or windows, to continually try to reduce the outdoor air from impacting the air quality inside. Continual ventilation and filtration, making sure that we have the highest filter efficiency that we can, that the system can withstand in the space, and then constantly making sure that those filters aren't overloading. So maybe increasing the HVAC PM schedules. Majority of companies usually look on a quarterly basis or semi-annual basis, but because we know that the air might not be great right now, maybe putting it on a monthly or bi-monthly basis of just checking the filters, making sure they're well fitted and that there's no dust overloading in them. And then also maybe adding portable air filters or cleaners to spaces to continue to clean the air and improve the air quality. So if there's odor issues, you're thinking about potentially the charcoal filters. If not, just just worried about the general particulate itself, the HEPA filters may be sufficient. And then lastly, another Cal OSHA guideline available is the worker safety and health of rebuilding. And this is, it's very vague and it's just a pretty small little guideline. It's pretty just much telling you about general construction regulations come into play. So we're starting to think about the construction standards, et cetera, associated with just building structures themselves. So as I stated, we aren't done with wildfires, unfortunately. We are probably going to have another one or more, most likely more. So it's very important as employers and communities that we have some wildfire preparedness plans. And I've been trying to preach this for a while that we have earthquake plans, right? A lot of us. We definitely need to start having wildfire preparedness plans because it's not if it's going to occur, it's when is it going to occur. So what can we do to prepare ourselves and to make sure that we are creating the best environment for our employees to work in? Well, one, we need to, I would say, as always, you need to have a written plan. You need to have something outlining what you're going to do when a wildfire occurs. And this discussion needs to be with various groups, not just the CEO or the higher ups or EHS. It needs to be a multidisciplinary approach. You need someone from facilities, you need someone from management, you need someone from EVS, and then the higher ups who may be paying for all of this. They all need to be working together in generation of this written plan. There also needs to be a chain of command as always. If a wildfire occurs, what are we going to do? Who's responsible for implementing what, etc. Training. People need to be trained on what to do as well. So if a wildfire is occurring, how are we going to respond? What is the impact of the wildfires to the individuals working in the space? A big one is HVAC maintenance, knowing your system, knowing, do you know how to reduce the amount of outdoor air being introduced in your space? Are you an old school building where they have to go up onto the roof and shut some of the outdoor air intake louvers, or is it all on an automated system where if they see AQI values rising or they start to smell smoke, they can implement controls with regard to the HVAC system? Same thing with the filters. Post-COVID, most people now use really high efficiency filters, which is great. Some resulted back in using some of the cheaper, less energy use ones. But we want to make sure that if a wildfire does occur, that you have the ability to put those high efficiency filters if they're not already in there. And understanding the system, making sure that it is clean, your air handling units, and working appropriately. And then supplies and equipment inventory list. You will see during wildfires things like getting portable those large industrial portable air filtering devices are hard to come by because everybody wants them. So kind of understanding what supplies would you want? Do you have a company or a contractor company that could help you supply those for you? Having names, contact information, types of equipment that you would require or would want. One great one is sticky mats, because again, as I stated, if your business is continuing during a wildfire event, again, we track a lot of stuff on our shoes, a lot of things come in from doorways. Having those sticky mats right there can help reduce it from getting anything anywhere further than 2 or 3 feet into the building. So those are supplies that you probably aren't going to have year long or necessarily need year long, but they're good to have on hand if necessary, or having a contact to purchase those items. And then the contact info, as I said, for others. Evacuation plan, and this mainly goes for those who are, if this is not just a smoke event for you, but actual potential for fire damage or burning of your structure, do people know where to go? Preparing your landscape, making sure that, and I have a few slides on that next, on fire protecting your property or your business, so you have a less potential for the fire to reach your property. Chemical inventory list in case, that's just necessary for the fire department, so they know what they're dealing with when they get there. And then more information on human resources. What do they plan on doing? Maybe allowing workers to work from home, telecommuting. All that should probably be evaluated beforehand so that you're not caught off guard. And what are we going to do now that a fire has occurred? And there's a website called firewise.org from the National Fire Protection Association. that gives great information on preparing your property to be fire smart. It goes over tree spacing, how far it should be. I didn't know until I went to this website that you shouldn't have mulch next to your house, which a lot of us do because it looks pretty. That just creates a potential for the fire when it reaches your property to ignite the structure itself. So limiting your space from being one of those areas that are more prone to the fires themselves. And again, here's some more stuff they have, extended zone, intermediate zone of how to protect and be fire smart and reduce potential for exposures. And that is it. It was a lot, and a lot of those topics that I went over could be their own 1 hour presentation, but we wanted to kind of give you guys a lot of stuff so that you can think about it. And then I know per Elizabeth and Veronica that there are other presentations and webinars that can be available now or in the future to discuss some of those specific items in a little bit more detail. And I will pass it over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Michelle, for that really insightful presentation. I think a lot of us had these questions kind of going into the wildfire and what the response is going to look like and what cleanup is looking like. Just, you sharing your experiences of what you're seeing on hand is really helpful. We do have a couple of questions from our participants. So I kind of wanted to kick off a little bit with how you were talking about in the beginning with how the direction of the wildfire smoke was kind of going towards the ocean. And you can see in your slide a little bit about, the direction for the Palisades fire and versus the direction for the Pasadena fire. So I did want to just touch a little bit upon like the impact of the Santa Ana winds, particularly for these wildfires. Could you tell us a little bit more about the characteristics of these winds? That can be really important to understand, the impacts from the wildfire perspective, but also how this could impact cleanup.
Yes, so the winds have a large impact on one during the fire event and post-fire because wind is not in our favor when we talk about wildfires at all. Even from before there is a wildfire event, I know that right before the Palisades fire started, we knew we had a high wind trigger warning. And for people, again, we talk about the anxiety of wildfires. People in those fire-prone areas start to get nervous when they see those high wind warnings coming out. So during the fires themselves, yes, they dictate who's going to be impacted. So again, normally the winds are going to want to go towards the ocean, which we're seeing a lot of the times, but then you have the Santa Ana winds and other wind directions that then shift. And now even more of a community is impacted. Like I stated, I was in the center of San Fernando Valley in Northridge. One day I would go out and it would smell like smoke because of the wind direction. And then the next week, even though the fire has gone even larger, it's no longer in my direction. So I think the winds play a big role in how impacted, how large of an impact to the community there's going to be. So the primary winds will heavily impact, but it doesn't mean that they're the sole ones associated with it. And then when we talk about the cleanup, the goal is to get the debris removed right away, right? Because we know that there's a potential when winds come, they're going to impact once again adjacent areas with the debris itself. And I know people are really into wanting to get rid of it right away. But when we talk about worker protection, there are stages that need to take place in evaluating those hazards. So I believe currently they're doing waste characterization, hazardous waste characterization of that debris just to identify for disposal issues. Where are these materials supposed to go? Regulatory requirements, if there's certain hazardous building materials need to be evaluated. And then worker protection. We need to make sure that we know what they're working with. So although the burn source is still there and we want to get rid of it right away, there are reasons why it takes a little bit longer because we need to make sure that you're disposing of it properly, following regulatory guidelines and protecting workers.
Yeah, thank you. I can definitely relate to the anxiety about Also being in the San Fernando Valley and seeing the different plumes kind of coming up in surrounding areas and just the impact of the wind, and you can smell smoke one day, it looks clear the next day, and it's just a ever-changing situation, and it's something that we need to be mindful of here in Southern California. And I really thank you for bringing up the point around wildfire preparedness, because now we know that it's not a question of if, but more when. So I did want to kind of go into a little bit of the example that you provided in terms of the monitoring that you did in the school in Malibu, because I think it kind of goes with this conversation around the wind direction. So what type of monitors were placed at the school in Malibu, and then what did you sample and what standards did you compare them to?
Yes. So the monitors we had measured a lot of the AQI stuff that we normally look at. We looked at carbon monoxide. We really evaluated the PM 2.5. That was our primary contaminant of concern. So the PM 2.5, the PM10, carbon monoxide. And then we had one for VOCs. What we primarily were looking at again was a particulate matter, and that's the one that was probably where we would get our threshold values. And there is no interior particulate exposure guidelines available to say that this much of PM 2.5 is okay in an interior building. So what we used was the AQI concentrations. So we would use that as our threshold levels, and with our client, came up with a number that we thought was good. Because again, all these contaminants are not specific to wildfires. They are a component of wildfires, but there's a lot of other different situations that could be going on that could also influence it. So we were mainly looking at the particulate matter, and that's what would normally set off alerts. But again, whether or not we can say that that was due to the burn debris issue, we could do that because again, thousands of properties were burned and thousands of acres. So, we just are assuming that there's a potential that it could have been caused by those areas. And then from there, dictated, as I said, actions to be taken. So if we're seeing the consistency in certain locations, so we did a few schools, we would put them at the outdoor air, near the outdoor air intakes on the roof. We put some on the ground level, and then we put a few in the interior. And generally what we saw, again, for years and 1 year of monitoring, months and months, is you would see changes in the outdoor air, as we would expect, but rarely did we ever see anything significant in terms of our indoor concentrations. And if we did see a peak in our indoor concentrations, it was usually justified by something that was going on in the interior environment. So for instance, sometimes we would get an alarm that room 201 had a peak in PM 2.5, and then luckily we were working close with the client. We'd say, we got an alarm, and they'd go over there and they're like, oh, they're doing this operation right now, or oh, somebody spilt this, or something, whatever the circumstances. It was usually explainable. And that's what we kind of expect, because again, you're indoors in you have a mechanical system, so you're filtering the air and you're closing the doors, and they had those control measures in place. So we rarely saw that. But again, if we got those data from the outside, it would help them in coming up with, okay, guys, maybe we're not going to do PE today, or maybe let's reduce the outdoor air a little bit more, so that if there is something outside that's potentially harmful, that we're not introducing, even though it's filtering, but maybe we'll just reduce it a little bit, so we don't necessarily need dirty outdoor air coming in. So that's what they found helpful. And it was great with, again, communicating with parents, because they are also worried at the same time. So you're doing some form of monitoring in real time, as well as developing action items once you get to certain levels. Never once did we ever say that that was the cause of it, but if it was right or wrong, they needed to do implementation of controls.
Thank you. We've been seeing a lot of questions around this exact area of what to do in these schools, especially in the areas that were nearby, or there are also affected areas where the schools are no longer there. So there's a shift to need to relocate students. So it's really important to to touch upon this, and thank you so much for sharing. I did want to ask, how long after the fire or like smoke event occurred were those monitors placed?
Um, well, we were out there to help clear the spaces, so we performed our own, we did our own normal investigation, like we talked about previously of doing the inspections. Then they did their cleaning. We came up with remediation recommendations. Then they did their cleaning. Then we did our post remediation assessment. And then probably right before, because if people did not want to go back to the schools, before they went back to the schools, we began putting the monitors out. And that was kind of a step to help get them to go back to the school. If I remember correctly, that timeline, but I believe it was that.
Thank you. Um, you mentioned a little bit about your experience going on to one of the properties recently and kind of the training that was being asked of you to be present on that specific area. Could you provide a little bit more clarification as to whether they were asking for the 24-hour HAZWOPER or the 40-hour?
For the inspection, I did not need any training. However, for the people in our company that will be doing the hazardous waste characterization, so they will be sifting through the debris, they are required to have the 40-hour HAZWOPER training
Yeah,
and
thank
fit
you.
testing, and I believe they needed CPR for say there a lot of requirements before they're letting people go out and do the work.
Yes, thank you. I know there's a couple of professionals on the call that may also be asked to perform this type of work or to assist. So providing this information as to what type of training you should be looking to and also preparing for, as we mentioned, it's not a matter of if, but when. Having training your staff who will be performing some type of activity or responding even at your own site. It's really important to have these types of trainings in mind. You did speak a little bit about the type of respiratory protection that LA County is uh, kind of mentioning, and primarily it's the N95 or the P100. Do you think using a PN95 might be appropriate?
A P, what was that, P in 95?
Yes.
Um, yeah, yes, that probably should be fine, but I mean, I would stick with the P100. I think the higher efficiency ones would be best.
Yes. I think it's really important. We were getting a couple of questions too about what to do in terms of if there's not enough supply. So if we could turn to different types of filters and whether they're still efficient. But yes, the higher the number, the greater the filter efficiency. Um, there is a question about wildfire ash may have asbestos, lead, and other contaminants. So how is a N95 meeting these regulations, especially since the lead standard was recently updated? So is this assuming that testing has been completed, or is there a need to also have more conversations with the county about what type of guidance should be provided?
Yes, that's a big topic here. So again, the document says at a minimum, but then we also have the caveat that you need to identify the hazard in development of the respiratory protection. So yes, I think they're just, again, because there's such a vast variation in the level of work. There's the house that didn't burn next door to the house that did versus a person 38 miles away that has just some char and ash next to a window. And so they have their minimum requirements, but where do you stop and where does that change to a higher level? So I know for us, um, we're if there's going to potentially clean up debris and you're next to a burned structure, you probably should either assume that it has lead and asbestos, or you need to evaluate and sample and see if it's present to determine if you're really close to a structure, there is a potential that it could be in there, and then you would want to evaluate that. So yeah, minimum is the N95 P100, but evaluation of a hazard would be necessary if you think that that would not meet it. So you need to evaluate for asbestos and lead and then provide the recommendations for that. So yes, that lead standard, which was revised, is really low exposures and action levels. So, and that definitely they would have to follow that standard if there is a known potential for lead to be present. They'd have to evaluate that exposure.
So just kind of to go based off of that, when we're talking about cleanup of non-burn structures, what type of monitoring can be done after the cleanup just to ensure that the methods used were effective? And then what types of contaminants may we be looking for?
I could just give you some common ones because again, that's going to depend on how close you were and what was found in the burn debris. But there's the smoke-related particulates, the char, the ash, and the soot. I know people say that that's super basic, but at the same time, we talked about that long list of contaminants that could be created during a fire, but sometimes formaldehyde's not present. But what we know will always be present is char, ash, and soot. So that's a good indicator that other potential stuff might be present. So that's always a good like initial round of sampling or just your common core samples to be collected. But again, we're thinking of potentially doing the lead wipes after the fact as well. Potentially asbestos after the fact as well, depending again on a lot of different circumstances. We've even done wipes for PAHs. We've done wipes for VOCs. I don't think we've ever got anything because again, it's after a while you really probably won't see anything like that on the surface, especially after cleaning. We could do air monitoring for using like a dust track to do particulate levels to evaluate the air. We've done other air sampling methodologies, but there's a wide different range, but those are some of the common ones that would be included.
Great, thank you. And just to kind of go off of that question a little more, is how long after the cleaning should this monitoring be done? Should it be done within a day, within a week? Based on your experience, what do you recommend?
So that's difficult for the people who are right next to the fire. So um, usually after they do the cleaning, you would want to be there right away, like within the next day. Usually, like any other post remediation assessment, mold, asbestos, etc. It's usually right after they do the work to verify before they leave or remove a containment, etc. Um, but again, we know that again the burned up structure next to a burned area has a potential for entrainment to continue. So you still would want to do that post assessment right after it's done, but that may not necessarily reflect any additional stuff that may come in. So if they're going to be returning home the next day, yes. If maybe they're returning a little bit later, maybe you do it once then and maybe reevaluate before they return.
Yes, it's definitely a really complicated situation, and I can definitely see how challenging it could be to give a straight answer as to this is exactly the type of monitoring, this is exactly what type of contaminants, but it really is very site specific, and it's going to really depend on the location of the non-burn structure because there's some structures that are close to the main area that was burned, but there's also instances where you're the only house that's standing. So the type of sampling that needs to be done and the type of protective equipment might be a little bit different depending on the proximity to these different areas. So I really appreciate you kind of going through a little bit of that thinking with us all. There was some questions about um, the type of PPE, and the recommendations of just using like kind of standard clothing. So how does this comply with any of the standards that we do have with Cal OSHA? And then just kind of curious on how we can ensure that we are following these regulations.
Got it. And I'm going to back up to your last one comment, and I was just going to say that's why it's important to have a qualified person, like an industrial hygienist or OEHS professional, who has the understanding that one size doesn't fits all, so that you're having someone evaluate and identify these issues because we know it's very important and goes case by case. And I was just going to add a little thing that AIHA is updating their fire page. They have a fire response page to kind of discuss this topic as well of following wildfires, so that the that we're providing resources for people who are industrial hygienists but maybe haven't necessarily done a lot of wildfire work, but we're in need of everyone, and you have the basic principles of worker protection. So you have the base that's necessary, but to give you a little bit additional information that'll be available. But with regards with the PPE, again, I think we went over the respiratory, that you need to evaluate what the potential hazards are, the present potential exposures, and then provide what respiratory protection will be required. And the same thing goes for the regular PPE. It's similarly, and that Cal OSHA fire cleanup guidelines has a section on PPE. It even goes into hard hats. Again, it appears to be geared to just those burn areas, but it does say fire damaged, burn structures and damaged structures. So how do we define damage, right? So maybe it got close to the fire and it did come and stain their walls inside, etc. That to me could still be considered a damaged structure. So they do have a lot more specifics and the applicable standards available as links for those specific type of like the goggles, the hard hats, etc., available for people to look at.
Yes, absolutely. Just to reiterate your point, it is really challenging to know exactly what to do, especially if you haven't been in this type of situation and being asked to do this type of work. So we will be sharing all of the resources that are also coming out of AIJ on our website. We also have email blasts, which will also be including that information as well. And then if you do have any suggestions for follow-up topics, we can also respond by having additional educational materials as well as webinars, as Michelle earlier noted. Before kind of closing us out, since we do have about 5 minutes or so, Michelle, do you have any last thoughts or anything else you wanted to share?
No, I feel like I said a lot, but it's just an ever evolving topic. And although I've been doing wildfire work since 2008, this is all new again as well. I mean, we have our basic principles, but this is a different situation with the amount of structures that burned and the amount of structures that didn't burn. So we're getting more information, things are changing, we're developing on the fly, and just using the basic principles of industrial hygiene to help dictate how we're doing our work. So don't be surprised if additional guidance documents come out on what needs to be done. But at least as industrial hygienists, we do have the basic principles on how to protect workers, even if LA County says N95 is sufficient, etc. So
Thank you. Can folks reach out to you directly or forensic analytical consulting services? Because I know a main part is the role of environmental health services, but can you also let folks know a little bit more about the other services that you all provide too?
yeah, so we're an environmental consulting company that does pretty much everything environmental: mold and moisture, asbestos, lead, exposure assessment, environmental health and safety plans, um, you name it. We work in healthcare facilities, construction sites, schools, residential, commercial buildings, landfills. So anything environmental you need help with or questions, we've got like 12 different CIHs. So all of us know a little bit about a lot of stuff, but some of us have expertise in certain areas. So if I don't know it, I'm pretty sure somebody within our company does. You can use me as a reference, and then I move you on to the appropriate party.
Yeah, thank you. As Michelle mentioned, it's really important for us to ask questions. This is a learning experience for everyone, and the learning continues through these events. So we want to encourage you to reach out to different organizations, reach out to the folks that are also providing resources, because they can also provide more tailored information based on your specific questions. So with that, I do want to pass it over to Veronica to close us out for today.
Thank you, Lisbeth, and thank you so much, Michelle, for sharing all of this knowledge with us in a much needed time. I did want to just point out that I put the evaluation link in the chat, and you'll also receive it in an email, so no worries if you don't get a chance to click it right now. I'm going to put it in the chat again. If you would like to receive continuing education hours, and you can select which type of hours you'd like to receive too, please don't forget to fill out the evaluation. Even if you don't need the continuing education hours, we'd love to hear your feedback, and please do reach out to us. We put the email a couple times in the chat, erc@ph.ucla.edu, if you have any further questions. If you have questions that are specific to your business, to your residents, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll also be connecting with Michelle. So with that, thank you all so much for attending. We'll have the recording up on our website later this afternoon. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.